using military records, government records, the letters and diaries of soldiers and nurses, contemporary newspaper accounts, photographs, and post-war memoirs, we know that there were women who served as soldiers in the Civil War. And they didn't look like women because in order to be a soldier, one had to be perceived as male. And so women who wanted to be soldiers had to cut off their hair, put on some men's clothes, pick a masculine name, and go enlist. And that's what they did. Now, of course, women enlisting in the Army was forbidden. There was no public recruitment of women, and yet a fair number of women, independently of each other, decided that they were going to serve anyway. So they picked masculine names. They tried to look as manly as possible, and what we realize from the women that we know about is a lot of them ended up passing as teenage boys, because it might be hard to look like an older man if you're a woman, but you can look like a teenage boy, and that explains, lack of facial hair. It explains maybe a voice that's a little higher than one might expect. We also know that once women had successfully gotten into the Army past their enlistment, that they would just sort of watch the guys around them and try to emulate how men might walk. One woman soldier said she learned how to spit in the Army. This photograph came to light after the book was published, and that is the caption on the back of the photograph. Catherine Lewis, 2nd Minnesota Infantry. But it looks like Catherine is still dressed as a man in this photograph. I still don't know which soldier in the 2nd Minnesota was Catherine Lewis, because the photograph doesn't give the alias under which she served. And if you want to find a woman soldier in military records, almost always you have to know the male name they were using. And so whoever helpfully captioned this photograph left out the one piece of information we need to actually fully document her. So one of the most common questions that I get about women soldiers in the Civil War is, well, how many were there?
Oh, God.
I don't know. I have no idea. And nobody else has any idea either. And the reason we have no idea is because they were hiding the fact that they were women. In order to be a successful soldier, the world had to perceive them as male. And so the only women that we're able to document today are women who were discovered to be women during the war, or who chose to share that information after the war. And in some cases, with women who were discovered during the war, we still don't know who they were. And a case in point is that one of the dead found on the field after Pickett's charge at Gettysburg was a woman. We're never going to know who that woman was. All we know, there's a dead woman on the field who was then buried in the same mass grave with all the other Confederate casualties. I personally documented about 200, and I would never be so vain as to think I found them all. But with the ones we know about, we have been able to document women soldiers in all of these battles. Basically, there was a woman at the beginning and there was a woman at the end. Because our study is skewed heavily towards women discovered, it made sense that becoming POWs would be a surefire way of being found out. So of the women we know about, a large percentage did end up in prison, but then prison is the reason we know about them. This is Sara Edmunds. She is probably the most famous woman soldier of the Civil War, and the reason she's the most famous, or one of the most famous, is because she actually wrote her memoirs. From our research, the vast, vast majority of women soldiers were pioneer women, they were immigrant women, they were poor women. Sara Edmunds is a little different. She's literate. Our sense is that a lot of women soldiers weren't. Either they were illiterate or they were poorly educated. Sara Edmunds was actually also Canadian, so she's really different from most of our women soldiers. But she grew up on a farm, so she already knew how to shoot a gun and ride a horse and all that good stuff. But her dad was kind of a jerk, and she cut her hair and dressed as a boy in order to run away from home. And she makes it to Michigan, where she thinks she'll be safe. And then she realizes, how is she going to make a living? She's a teenager. There aren't a lot of employment opportunities available to women. You can be someone's maid. You can be someone's prostitute. You can work in a mill for less money than men get. So she stayed in her male persona. So when the war broke out, she was Franklin Thompson. She was a bookseller. And she enlisted in the 2nd Michigan, and she served, and she ended up later deserting because she came down with malaria. And she knew if she went to the hospital, they'd find out she was a woman, so instead she deserted. But we know about her because when she was convalescing, she wrote her memoirs. She jazzed them up a bit, to increase sales. But she's legit. And so at some point after the war, she decides she wants, to resume living her life as a woman. She marries, has children. She got a pension from the U.S. government as a soldier. And the reason she got that pension is because her male comrades vouched for her. They wrote letters in support. The pension bureau said, but she, he, whoever, we don't care, was a deserter. You can't get a pension if you're a deserter. So her comrades, some of whom were well placed, said, let's take this to Congress. So she actually ended up getting her pension by act of Congress. They removed her charge of desertion, and they did it because men vouched for her.
Yes.
This is Sara Rosetta Wakeman. She enlisted in the 153rd New York Infantry under the alias Lyons Wakeman. She is another woman who was already passing as a man before the war. So when we were researching women soldiers, one of the sort of research rabbit holes we went down was passing. And in the 19th century, there were a fair number of working class women passing as men. And they were passing as men largely for a paycheck and for privilege. Rosetta Wakeman, her family was deeply in debt. She needed to get a job to help her father not lose the farm. And she decided, she cut off her hair and put on her brother's clothes, she could get a better paying job that wasn't any harder than what she was doing. So again, she was already living life as a man when the war started. She enlisted, started making $13 a month, which was a lot of money for a farm girl. She spent most of her service in the defenses of Washington. Then her regiment was transferred to the Red River Campaign. And Lyons Wakeman died of dysentery in New Orleans in 1864 at the age of 22. She is buried under her alias in Chalmette National Cemetery. The only reason we know that Private Lyons Wakeman is a woman is because Private Wakeman wrote letters home. and Wakeman's sister saved the letters, and they were passed down to her sister's descendants. But if she hadn't have written home, or if those letters hadn't survived, we would have no idea. We wouldn't know that Lyons Wakeman, who died for her country, was a woman. Okay, one of these two soldiers is a woman, can you guess? This is Albert Cashier, who is the other really famous woman soldier. And Albert's kind of having a moment right now in popular culture because Albert Cashier was born Jenny Hodgers in Ireland. It's not sure when she immigrated, who she immigrated with, but we know that in 1862, Albert Cashier was in Illinois and already had the persona of Albert Cashier. Albert Cashier enlisted in the 95th Illinois, served a full 3-year enlistment, was in about 40 battles and skirmishes, and was never wounded. By all accounts, she was a good soldier. No one ever thought Albert was a woman, except apparently Albert's comrades always made fun of Albert for being short, for not being able to grow a beard. Albert Cashier, after the war, stayed Albert Cashier. In fact, Albert Cashier lived his full adult life as a man. When we wrote the book, we assumed that Albert's life story was one of, again, working class women passing for paycheck, for privilege. Albert was well thought of, had a lot of friends, was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. So when we wrote the book, we thought that Albert had too much to lose by ever being Jenny. Now, I wonder, and that could still be true, but now we're also wondering if perhaps Albert Cashier may be a trans individual, which is something we didn't think of in 2002 when we published the book, but it's something that we are thinking about now. And I don't think we'll know the answer, but I think we should consider it, given that most of the women soldiers we know did at some point in their life go back to living a traditional life. Albert did not. So, you know, it's something to ponder. And again, we don't know. When the Pension Bureau, and it's a really sad story, so Albert would have gone to his grave and no one would have been the wiser, except he got hit by a car in 1911. When the Pension Bureau found out that they were pensioning a woman who was pretending to be a man, they went nuts. And so Albert has a pension file. I'm not kidding. It's this thick. So we know a lot about Albert Cashier, but the one thing we don't know is why Albert, probably as a teenager, began living as a man and opted to do that the rest of his life. This is Frances Clayton. She was kind of typical in that about a third of women who went off to war went to war with their husbands or their fiancés, a couple with their dad, a few with their brother. So she was part of the husband-wife team, which was, we think, about a third, at least, of the ones we've been able to document. But her husband gets killed, and at that point she decides, all right, I'm done. And these, I'm almost positive, are her post-service publicity photos. These are her glamour shots. This is Frances Hook. She was an orphan from Chicago. She went to war with her brother because she didn't want to be left alone in Chicago when her brother went off to war. So her brother gets killed and she gets captured. So she was captured by Confederates in Alabama in December 1862, and she gets sent to Atlanta as a prisoner. So she tries to escape. The guard shoots her in the leg, and they find out that she's female. So she gets exchanged. They send her back through Union lines because they don't want a woman prisoner, and they definitely don't want a wounded woman prisoner. So she goes to a military hospital in Chattanooga, and they keep her there till she gets well because she's a soldier. These two photos were taken while she was in the hospital, like someone loaned her a dress, and these photos were sold to sort of raise money for her. So when the doctor said she was well enough to leave the hospital, the Union authorities said, okay, you gotta go home, and they put her on a train to Chicago. And that was the end of her service. In like 1909, her daughter wrote a letter to the War Department asking for her mother's military service record. So the clerks looked through the stuff and wrote a nice letter back to her daughter. This is Martha Lindley after the war. So she also went to war with her husband. When she enlisted, she was 27 years old, and she was 5'8", and her alias was Jim Smith. Thankfully, her descendants passed down, information not just about grandpa, but also grandma. And so it was one of her descendants that gave me the picture of her swords and her pistol. So my favorite story about her is her husband they were in the cavalry, and her husband got shot in the ankle, and he gets sent off to the hospital, and she was like, yeah, bye. You would expect a proper Victorian woman to go take care of her man. No. She stayed. She stayed with the regiment until she was honorably discharged at the expiration of her enlistment. Now here's another maddening photo. This came to light after the book was published. That's the caption on the back. Again, you can't document someone when all you have is Cora's sister. I suspect they all had the same fear, which was being found out. Albert Cashier, Martha Lindley were never found out. Frances Hook didn't get discovered till she was captured. Some women, like the woman at Gettysburg, were only recognized posthumously. And the other way that women got discovered as women was being wounded. If a woman went to the hospital, that was probably a surefire way that she was going to get discovered. So, 6 women were identified as women after they had babies. 6. I still don't believe it, and I wrote it, So on April 17th, 1863, General Rosecrans sent the following telegram. Yes. And I'm quoting, "The medical director reports that an orderly sergeant in Brigadier General Johnson's division was today delivered of a baby, which is violation of all military law." So Sarah Jane Perkins was a school teacher near Danville, Virginia. So again, she's a little unusual in that she's an educated woman, probably middle class-ish. She enlisted in the Confederate artillery that became part of the Army of Northern Virginia. When she was captured by Union troops on May 27, 1864 at the North Anna River, she was wearing her hair braided and was making no attempt to pass. So the Union soldiers recognized immediately that they had captured a woman, and they were a little confused. She wasn't the only Confederate woman we found in the last 2 years of the war not bothering to pass anymore. We just know more about her than some of the others. So she gets captured, and even though they know she's a woman, they don't know what to do with her, so she gets sent to Point Lookout with all the other Confederates that they're capturing during the Overland Campaign. The commandant at Point Lookout is like, I can't take her. She's a woman, can't keep her. So she gets transferred to Old Capitol Prison in Washington, which does have a women's wing. But apparently Perkins, like, literally was called unruly, and she gets sent from Old Capitol. She and another woman who was a blockade runner get sent to the House of Correction in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, which was a state prison that had a women's wing, but the feds were putting bad prisoners there, and they sent Sarah Jane there. So unlike a lot of women POWs who got exchanged, sent home as quickly as possible, she ends up staying incarcerated until March of '65, when she is sick and authorities relent and send her to Fort Monroe, and from Fort Monroe she was released to Richmond, and the trail goes cold. So we don't know what happened to Sarah Jane Perkins after March of 1865. But she didn't arrive at Richmond in a very good time. So, as a group, we did not find any court-martialed women. So that tells us that, you know, the women who were not discovered and sent home did a good job, or were good, faithful soldiers, serving to the best of their ability, like the men with whom they served. We found women at every rank from drummer boy to captain. Now there was one case that I think is nepotism because the lieutenant was married to the captain. So that's our story of women soldiers. Albert again. We got 2 photos of Albert. So that's their story, and essentially, so statistically, women soldiers are irrelevant. Statistically, you know, the military service of women did not alter the course of the war. It didn't alter the course of a single battle. The war would have been the same whether or not women enlisted. I find them to be culturally significant. They are indicative of the life of poor women and working class women who are basically always omitted from most histories, even women's histories. No one's looking at, you're illiterate, you're down the social rung, and that's what these women were. But they show that our accepted gender norms, and especially what we think about Victorian society and Victorian women, might not be accurate. And I think they're important just because they were there and they sure weren't supposed to be. So, thank you.